Hey everybody, this is Chris for AFA Supplies, and today we're going to take a real quick look at some of the differences between water-based clay and oil-based clay. Now you might be thinking they're both just clay, they should probably do about the same thing, but they're actually two very different beasts and they cater to two very different working styles. So the first distinction you're going to notice is that with water-based clay, it's really soft. You'll notice as I kind of play around with this a little bit, it has a super soft, super easy to use consistency, very pliable, very malleable. And this is great, especially if you're working on larger work, because it allows you to lay up the clay that much faster. So if you're working on, for instance, let's say a life-size sculpt, and you're working on a deadline, you may want to consider going with a water-based clay, because it's going to make it that much faster and that much easier to realize a larger form. Now with oil-based clay, you'll notice this is a soft clay. This is Chavant's NSP soft, and it's considerably firmer than the clay that I was using for illustrative purposes over here, which is Laguna Clay's EM217, otherwise known as WED. So you'll notice as I try to move the clay around, it's just not as easy. It's not as pliable, it's not as malleable. It requires a little bit more effort, which is great if you're working on something smaller and you're doing, say, fine detail. But again, if you're working on something large and you're on a deadline, you may want to consider water-based clay. Another advantage to water-based clay, cost. And this is probably the biggest advantage. It's ridiculously cheap. A 50-pound case of Laguna's WED clay, for instance, only costs 30 bucks. A 40-pound case of one of the more popular oil-based clays, like Chavant on the other hand, is going to cost you nearly $170. So water-based clay is substantially less expensive, but that's also where the advantages end. Water-based clay actually requires quite a bit of maintenance, so whereas with something like an oil-based clay that can sit out for days, weeks, months, sometimes even years without any issue, water-based clay will actually start to dry and crack after just a few hours. So often what you'll find yourself doing is spraying it with a spray bottle and wrapping it with saran wrap in between sessions. Now, because water-based clay is so soft, it's also difficult to realize any kind of fine detail in, which isn't to say that it can't be done. We actually have plenty of artists who do just that, and they do brilliant work. All things being equal, it's typically just easier to realize fine detail in the firmer clays, and the firmer clays just happen to be oil-based. Another great feature of most oil-based clays is that they can actually be reused. Water-based clays, like I mentioned earlier, are kind of a one-and-done deal, but oil-based clays can and often are reused for multiple projects. So that definitely cuts into the cost advantage of water-based clay. And then there's the mold. Now mold isn't really something you have to worry about with oil-based clay. There's just not enough moisture in it for that to be an issue, but that's not the case with water-based clay. Mold is actually a pretty common issue, especially during the summer months. And if you're allergic to mold like I am, water-based clay can be a bit of a bear to work with. It involves wearing gloves, scraping off the surface layer, and really wasting time that could otherwise be spent sculpting. So as you can see, both clays have very clear advantages and disadvantages. With water-based clay, you get something that's soft, it's pliable, it's malleable, it's easy to work with, great for life-size sculpts, but you also have the downside of the clay, which is first and foremost the mold issue, but also the fact that it dries out and it cracks. You have to spray it with a water bottle once every few hours, and in between sculpting sessions you're going to want to wrap it with saran wrap. That's a lot of maintenance. It's a little bit too much for me, probably a little too much for most, and so I think most people are going to elect to go with an oil-based modeling clay. Now again, with oil-based modeling clays, the advantages are you can leave it out for weeks and months at a time without any of the issues of water-based clay. There is no drying, there is no cracking. It's also a little bit firmer, so it's easier to realize fine detail in. But the disadvantage is it's admittedly a little bit more expensive, so that's something you want to keep in mind. Now if you're still undecided, go ahead and visit our website at afasupplies.com and request a free sample of both the clays you saw here today. Hopefully that'll give you a better idea which clay is going to work best for your specific project. Again, I'm Chris for AFA Supplies. Thanks for watching.